Hey everyone, my name is Sami Laiho. I'm a Microsoft MVP from Finland. It's really difficult for me to believe that it's actually been 5 years since I hosted the Sysinternals 20th birthday party. And now having the privilege of Mark inviting me to speak, and not just about anything, but about Process Monitor, which is the second most downloaded tool on the Sysinternals toolkit. I personally teach Sysinternals and Windows internals all around the world, and I speak at different conferences, and I have been doing this for more than half my life, for about 20 to 25 years. I'm a Microsoft MCT and MVP and all sorts of stuff. I love showing this slide always, because when I introduced myself at Ignite, they gave me a presentation deck that had one line that said, "Please fill in all your certificates." And I just piled them on the floor, and I thought, what am I going to write here? But then I came up with a great idea, and I just actually put them on a kitchen scale and I weighed them. So I have 2.6 pounds of certifications. But heading into the topic today, I have heard so many great speakers talk about Sysinternals tools for the past 25 years or so. I mean, when I started my career, those were the tools that got me started. And I had the privilege of going to a Windows internals class once, which was taught by David Solomon and Mark Rusinovich, whom both you have or will hear today. And David always said that if something breaks in Windows, run Regmon and Filemon. Those two tools later on ended up being what nowadays is known as Process Monitor. Process Monitor itself is a tool that shows you main categories of file, registry, network, process, and performance measurements, and it outputs a lot of stuff. And easily, when I teach Process Monitor, I have like two different skill sets. I teach people how to press the buttons, and then I have another course where I have to teach people of what you actually see with it, because those are two different skills. Process Monitor can easily output hundreds of thousands of lines in a trace file, and your job of deciphering what that actually means is a totally different skill set. What I'm aiming today to do is give you some tips and tricks on how you might make your life a little bit easier with the tool. After downloading the tool itself, the tool has a 32 and a 64-bit version. And depending on your platform, you choose the correct one, or depending on the trace file that you're looking at, you choose the correct version. When you start Process Monitor itself doesn't actually require admin rights if you're just looking at a trace. But if you are tracing yourself, then there is a requirement for admin rights, because you have to install a device driver. And this device driver is a filter driver. So with the command fltmc, you can actually see that. And here on the screen, you can see that Process Monitor filter. This that you see on the screen is a list of different filter drivers, and you can see the altitude value next to them. And this altitude value, it's kind of a nosedive. So input-output packets go through these filter drivers, starting from the highest altitude and going down as a nosedive towards the lowest altitude. Sometimes the packets actually don't hit Process Monitor early enough or late enough, which means that these can actually be changed in the registry. So there is a way of changing these values in the registry. There's no real GUI way of doing this, but it is doable. And I have to do it occasionally when I have to trace, for example, what a Windows Defender or another kind of security solution, for example, is doing. Talking about filtering, there are a few things that I felt like life-altering when I saw Aaron Marcos' show one of these as the first thing on a session he did at Ignite. And it really changed the way I'm using Process Monitor. The problem with Process Monitor is that it is really difficult to keep Process Monitor running for extended periods of time, because it outputs so much data. Let's dig into a demo and see how we can actually keep Process Monitor running. Here on this demo environment, I have a Windows 10 machine, and I intentionally have an older version, Windows 7, next to me, but we'll keep that for now. And I'm actually going to demonstrate quite a lot of different things about Process Monitor at the same time. So first, let's just go and start off ProcMon. When ProcMon loads, you can see that the numbers down below start increasing very heavily. So we have already 15,000 events being captured, and that number there is increasing heavily. Now the problem is that if you look at the default settings of the packing files where this trace data is actually stored, then these are stored in the page file. Now at the end of the day, if you fill your page file, by default Windows will allow you to just increase the page file size, basically as long as you run out of space on your C drive. And we all know that Windows doesn't really work if you run out of space on your C drive. If you keep it here, leave it running over the night, the problem is you are going to face a computer that you need to reboot in the morning. So let's just get out of there. For now, I am just going to stop the trace itself, and you can do that by pressing Ctrl E as well. So there's a shortcut for that. I'm also going to clean out the log file for now, so that'll be Ctrl X if you want to use the keyboard. I'll start this off by showing you a problem I had on my own computer. I once had my own computer in a situation where I suddenly couldn't access the internet anymore. And when I was trying to access the internet and I couldn't do it, I went troubleshooting all around the place, and then I realized that I actually had suddenly a proxy setting that had appeared from nothing or from nowhere. It was set to 127.0.0.1, which is the loopback address of Windows. Now, for a security person like me, this feels horrible because this sounds like maybe someone's hacked me because they're trying to route all the traffic back to the computer itself. I just removed the setting and everything worked fine. Then, about 2 weeks later, the same problem appeared. I knew what to look for. I went to take out the setting. I could get online again, all good. Maybe a week after that, same thing happens again. Now the problem is very common for me as a troubleshooter, which is that I'm never there when something happens. Customer calls me and says, Sami, can you come and check out this issue? I'll go there, check out the issue, and they can never reproduce it while I'm there. This was kind of the same thing. I was never there when it actually happened. But if I leave Process Monitor running, I can't run it for 2 weeks. Let's first figure out where this setting actually is so that we can monitor and report when something goes and alters it. First things first, let's open up Process Monitor, and I am going to set a filter whenever I'm trying to find a registry setting and I don't know where it is, then I will use Process Monitor, and I always start with a certain filter. And that filter is operation is rec set value. Many people, when they use Process Monitor to figure out what an application does, investigate how an application works, they start to monitor for that certain process. But I don't do it that way, but instead I always look for all changes in the registry while I was tracing. That okay. And then I am going to start tracing. And then I'm going to go for the setting that I want to change. And I'm going to change it to something else. So I'll just change this to 127.0.0.2. Hit OK. We can go back to Process Monitor, stop tracing, so we don't have that much stuff there. And if you have any kind of a string in your setting, it might be easy to just go and press Ctrl F and try to find the string. So we made a string which was 127.0.0.2. And we'll just hit find next. And here we can see that setting. So it set something like proxy server. Remember that the most important thing many times for Process Monitor is actually hiding here. So the detail column hides the actual values. And here you can see the value. There's another thing to Process Monitor which is called quick filtering. So if I right click on a column, I can just choose to include only this. Now we see only entries that somehow affect this proxy server. So first go on and enable the tracing. We're going to go back to the setting that I had. So we're going to open up that again. And then we'll go and open connections, LAN settings. We're going to set this again. Hit OK. Hit OK. Go back to ProcMon. And we can see that we can now see when something changes that setting. Great. But the problem lies down here. We only have one event showing, but we have more than 200,000 events already in the log. Which means that I can't keep this here for 2 weeks because I'll fill the page file. ProcMon by default only filters the view, not the content that actually goes into the log, but only what you see on the screen, which is great so that we can later on get things back on the screen without filtering them out forever. But for being able to do this for the next 2 weeks, let's try something else. I'm going to stop tracing again. I'm going to clean the log. And now what I'm going to choose is I'm actually going to go and I will say that we have the filter, and we're going to choose drop filtered events. Now when I start to capture again, you can see that there's no events in the log. And what happens instead is we are actually filtering before we put things into the log. If I go and change my setting again, and we'll go and just change that now to, let's say, back to 127001. Okay, okay. Go back to ProcMon. Only one event and showing all one events. Now you can easily keep ProcMon running for the next 2 weeks to just capture the problem. And if someone's interested, it was just a faulty version of OneDrive, which for some reason thought that because I had Visual Studio installed, it started rerouting the traffic back for debugging purposes. And OneDrive, a cloud service that sets the proxy server to be the loopback address, you could call that really counterproductive. But anyway, so that's just a good tip. I'm gonna clean this out and I'll just turn on our filtering to normal. Now, getting to the next topic. When you want to script Process Monitor, the first thing is that you should note that when you just run ProcMon / and you can see a huge amount of different kinds of command line parameters. If you actually look very carefully, you can see a cool new thing there that was introduced some time ago, which kind of can give you the same benefits as the demonstration before. And there is a flight recording mode. So you can have it to use a circular log and just not spend that much of your hard disk space. Does not remove the need for the previous demo, but it is a good background, all the time black box kind of flight recorder. Anyway, I have a very common question that I get from my customers, which is how do I troubleshoot someone else's computer because ProcMon does not support remote monitoring. Well, that's true. ProcMon does not support remote monitoring. I can't use ProcMon on my machine and ask it to record another computer. But what I can do is take another Sysinternals tool. There are people who would tell me that you should do this in PowerShell. I want to be hip and cool as well, which means that I do have demonstrations now on Sysinternals tools, but after this I'll show you examples on how you can do that with PowerShell as well. But now let's just dig in and try how we can actually make Process Monitor record on a remote computer. So now that we are concentrating on Sysinternals, I will use PSXSec. And with PSXSec, I am going to start Process Monitor on the computer next to me. I intentionally have a different operating system version here so that we can learn a few other things about Process Monitor's abilities. So I'm going to use PSXSec, and I'm going to say that PSXSec, please run with system rights without waiting for the process to end. Those are those parameters. The computer is called student25, and I'm going to say, please run ProcMon. Now, if ProcMon is already on the machine, that's fine. If it's not there yet, you have to add another parameter here for C, which means copy. And that means that it'll copy the binary first over to the other computer. So we use ProcMon. Now, the most commonly used parameter of all Sysinternals tools probably is the accept EULA, which means that we don't know if the other computer has already accepted that EULA, which means that we're going to have to do that when we use these in batch files, for example. So Process Monitor, and now we need to get that file to ourselves somehow. So I'm going to set a packing file, and I'm just going to put it in the ctemp folder called process.pml, which is the default format. I don't want it to whisper anything to the user interface. On that other machine, let's pretend that we have an issue with Notepad here. So this person here will now, after we told them that please reproduce the problem, they're going to just start Notepad and do something with it. I'm just going to generate some traffic to the trace file. So I'll just open some dialogues here and do something like this. And after they have reproduced the problem, then it's time for us to stop monitoring. Now, if you go and kill Process Monitor, it'll corrupt the PML file, which means you have to gracefully stop it. So with PSXSec, we are going to tell ProcMon now, instead of backing up anything, we are going to just say terminate. And now, after terminating Process Monitor on that machine, then we can just do copy student 25 C drive and procsys.pml. I'll copy it to my own temp folder, and then we can use ProcMon. Let's just open up ProcMon, and I'll just reset the filter, and I'll say open. I am going to open that file from the C temp folder. And now a few other things. First of all, if you go for tools and choose system details, we can verify that this is actually coming from the other computer. It's not Windows 10 like my computer here, but Windows 7 Service Pack 1 like you can see on the right side. Also, another great tool inside of Process Monitor is the process tree. The process tree shows you almost like a snapshot of Process Explorer and shows you what was running during that lifetime of that trace file. And there we can, for example, see that many of these files were running all the time, or processes were running all the time. But then we can also see that we have this notepad here. You can just use this, right click and add process to include filter. And then you will have a process monitor trace taken remotely from another computer, concentrating on the problematic application that we had. When I have an issue with my customers and I need to troubleshoot something, I always tell them that there are two things I need at least. The other one is a process monitor trace, and the other one is a network trace. Process monitor trace, you can start with PSXEC running ProcMon on the other machine. You can do the same thing for NetSH trace. Since Windows 7, network tracing is built into the operating system even without installing Wireshark or Message Analyzer or anything like that. Like I promised, here is the hip and cool PowerShell example as well. So nothing prevents you from doing this over PowerShell, but I think it was just a really neat thing to do that with PSXEC because it is Sysinternals' birthday party anyway. If you want to know what happens during a boot in Windows, the problem of course is that ProcMon is not running by default, but we can set Process Monitor to be a critical boot driver as well. And setting that allows us to capture also, for example, load times of different drivers and to see a good picture of how the boot process actually behaves. So now in Process Monitor, if you go and choose options, there is an option here called Enable Boot Logging. And we can also generate profiling events every second or every 100 milliseconds, which means that it takes like a snapshot of the most common measurements of your performance, like CPU, memory, and stuff like that. But let's just do this without. Then you have to go out of Process Monitor, and then you just go and reboot the machine. So now, here we have the ready log to look at, but this is so disappointing because I was just bragging that we can use Process Monitor to see how the boot times are, and we can see how the boot drivers work and the load orders and try to find big gaps in the load times and stuff like that. But actually we can't see anything. I mean, it all starts here with the subsystem manager and there's nothing before it. And this is another important thing that you have to learn, which is that by default, Process Monitor has a very dramatic filter set on it. And if you look at the filter here, you can see that there's a lot of exclusions here. There's a few things here to point out. And for example, here, you can see the reason why you can't use Process Monitor to troubleshoot Process Explorer without touching the filter. Also, if you have someone who still insists that it is a great idea to move your page file from a disk to another, and you have to prove them whether the page file is even used or not, if you're trying to monitor for access to the page file, well, same thing here. Page file access is not shown. There's two options. You could go and just remove all of this, but it's even easier if you just go for filter and choose enable advanced output. This will take out the filter. And now you can see that we have loaded the Process Monitor sys file here, and then you can see all the drivers that are loaded after it. And that's a way to actually capture a boot trace in ProcMon. One more thing, which is very common to all of the Sysinternals tools, and that is that by default it shows you a huge amount of information, sometimes maybe a little bit of an overload of information, but if you really want to see more information, you can do that. Now, the binaries that we are, or the processes that we're tracing with the tools for Sysinternals, when the processes load binary into the operating system, well, the binary operating on the computer doesn't really have to know any friendly names for functions, for example. They just need to know addresses where to jump to when something happens. And that means that if you go and use Process Monitor for looking at the stacks of a certain thread, for example, it will only show you addresses by default. We can decipher those, especially when we're talking about Microsoft binaries. We can use what's known as a public symbol server, and we can download symbol files. And those symbol files contain information of how to decipher those numbers or those hex addresses into actually human readable function names, for example. This is a two-part thing that you need to do. First of all, we have to have a debugger that supports downloading symbols. The default debugger that is in the C Windows System 32 folder cannot do that, but if you install the SDK, you can find a debugger that is capable of downloading those symbol files. And then the other part is that we have to understand where to download those symbol files for. There are two ways of setting this. You can set this in the Process Monitor options, but then you would have to set it in the Process Explorer options as well, which means that if you want to do this for all Sysinternals tools and at the same time most of the debugging tools as well, you can also use a system variable. And that system variable you can see here down on the screen. So _NT _ symbol _ path pointing to SRV asterisk, then the local cache folder, and then star or asterisk, and then the download location for the Microsoft's public symbol server. Now, this is Microsoft stuff, so if you have your own code, you have your own symbol files, you can dump them to the local cache folder as well, or point to a server. This can point to multiple locations as well, just divided by or separated by the asterisk sign. But let's see that in action as well. So now that you're looking at a trace file, and if you go and right click on anything here and choose properties, or you can just click on the stack there already, but you can get there from here as well. And you can see that we have these things running on the computer, but you can see that we have these hex values here. And these hex values, I really don't know what they are because they're just the addresses inside of code. They are sadly not like Visual Basic script lines, which would be super easy to decipher. But at least we can make some sense of these by doing a few changes. First of all, you have to have the symbol file set. This one you can do from the system properties, and we'll just go for advanced environment variables, and here you can see the _NT _ symbol _ path pointing to this value. And now I have set that already. Now if we go for Process Monitor and go for options and configure symbols, you can see that that is filled from that variable. But the debugger here will not do. So we'll have to change this to the SDK one that I've installed on the machine already. So that'll live in Program Files x86 and Windows Skits 10, debuggers, and x64. And then just hit open. That's it. You do have the possibility of even pointing at your source code files if you would really want to see the location inside of the source code, but we'll just hit OK here. Now, if we go and choose properties, you can see down there it says loading symbol, module per module. It's starting to download, and you can see that we have these numbers gradually changing into text before your eyes. So that'll give you at least a little bit more information on the stacks of the process that you're looking at, and that'll help you out in building more accurate Google searches or building more accurate pointers of where to search for the solution. And I hope that some of these tips will help you out as much as they have helped me during my career. I have had the pleasure of a few times sitting in an airplane where someone next to me is listening to what I'm trying to do and then just looks at me and says, "Why didn't you use ProcMon?" And I try to remind myself of that. I have a t-shirt, and the t-shirt always reminds me to just keep calm, use ProcMon. And if you have anything that you need for Sysinternals or Windows internals in general, you can always reach me on Twitter. My Twitter handle is @Sami Laiho. It has been a privilege, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the show. Thank you so much.